Ho ho, hello guys. I'm sorry I've been gone for 4 months. Uh, but hey, I'm back now during Christmas break. I'm planning on reading two one-part horror stories for this Christmas. So, I hope you enjoy. When selling a house, if a death occurred within 3 years of the house going on the market, the seller is required to inform potential buyers of said death. This little requirement wasn't necessary in my case. Everyone within a 50-mile radius seemed to know about Victoria Teller. It was a tragic story. She had given birth to a bouncing baby boy whose father no one seemed to know. The baby passed away just a few months later, and Victoria took her own life a year after that. That much was known to be true. What was unknown were the circumstances surrounding the incident, how the baby died. Some said accident, some said illness, some said murder. How Victoria killed herself and what happened in between. The popular rumor was that Victoria, in her grief-stricken psychosis, began buying dolls to replace her dearly departed son. The doll would then suffer the same fate as the real baby in her mind, and she would bury it and move on to another. People, mostly teenagers, made it a holiday tradition to search for the doll graveyard. They searched the backyard and the woods behind it, but nothing was found in the 6 years that the house was empty. I was confident that the house that I had bought for my family and me had nothing strange in its history but two tragic deaths. It was the first year that my son Caleb was really aware of anything other than presents. We lined the roof and windows with lights, hung a wreath on the door, and put some standing decorations on the lawn. We bought and decorated a tree big enough to fit a toy store underneath, which was appropriate because of how many presents Santa was going to bring Caleb this year. He was getting more and more excited each day, especially since we had been dropping some pretty big hints that he was getting a puppy. My family was the happiest it had ever been, until a week before Christmas. My wife had been wrapping presents as we bought them so we didn't have to stay up all night on Christmas Eve like we had the previous year. She had opened the door to the closet that held the presents to find the wrapping paper torn to shreds. Her first thought was that Caleb had gotten into them, but I doubted that he would be able to contain his excitement if he had. It looked almost as if some sort of rodents had shredded the paper, but the boxes weren't damaged at all. We brushed it off as a mystery and moved the presents to the attic after wrapping them. I occasionally heard some shuffling from inside the closet, but I never saw whatever critter had caused it. I figured I would call an exterminator after Christmas to check inside the walls. Soon, things started to get really strange. I walked into the bathroom to find the dirty clothes scattered around the room and the hamper on its side. My wife found the refrigerator door hanging open with food torn up and thrown on the floor. Caleb was distraught one morning when he woke up to find all the toys he had carefully placed in his toy box the night before had been thrown all around his room while he slept. All this and the noises in the walls were getting more frequent and were heard everywhere in the house. My superstitious wife was becoming scared that the local urban legend was true, that Victoria Teller still haunted the house. She reasoned that the spirit was becoming more active because we were so happily preparing for the holiday with our son, something she never got to do. I laughed at her theory. I shouldn't have. Christmas Eve, my wife and I put Caleb to bed. We had to return to his room several times to tell him that if he didn't go to sleep, Santa wouldn't bring him anything. When I was convinced that he was finally going to stay in his bedroom, I picked the puppy up from my mother's house and brought it home. We hadn't named him yet, but he was a golden retriever puppy that was as energetic as he was soft and fluffy. After playing with him for a while, we put him to bed in his crate, ate the cookies Caleb left for Santa, and turned in for the night. I was jerked from my slumber by a blood-curdling scream. My wife and I followed our son's cries for help to the living room. Caleb had snuck out of bed and found the puppy. Instead of the happy fluff ball that we had left by our tree, he found a mangled metal crate filled and surrounded by fur, blood, and chunks of discarded meat. My wife took Caleb into another room to console him, while I checked for intruders and signs of a break-in. I found nothing, so I returned to the living room and began cleaning up the mess. I was kneeling on the floor, convincing myself that there was a silver lining in the fact that we had hardwood floors instead of a carpet, when I heard a tinkling noise coming from the tree. I turned my head just in time to see a pair of big blue eyes staring at me from the branches. I jumped to my feet and backed up a few paces just as the first doll dropped from the tree. It was followed by 3 others. They were those delicate porcelain dolls, wearing what were probably pretty little dresses at one time. I couldn't tell because the dresses were covered in dirt and blood. I watched with the mixture of terror and disbelief as all 4 dolls slowly rose from the ground and started toward me. The scream of my wife and son snapped me out of my horrified trance. The dolls' heads turned as I ran from the room to find my family. I raced up the stairs to my bedroom where I found my wife standing on our bed with Caleb in her arms. Dozens of porcelain dolls varying in states of damage and filth were standing on the floor surrounding the bed. They were making their way toward my loved ones with their tiny arms stretched out, reaching for the woman and child who were desperately trying to stay away. I started kicking the little demons out of the way as I hurried to rescue my wife and child. I didn't think a bunch of dolls would be so hard to push through, but I was wrong. For every one that I kicked, 4 more came at me. They grabbed and pulled and thrashed and bit, and I found myself moving away from the bed instead of toward it. After noticing that most of the dolls had directed their attention to me, I yelled for my wife to run. I hoped that I served as enough of a distraction for the demon toys that her and Caleb could get away unharmed. The dolls were still trying to reach them, were clinging onto the side of the bed, climbing with delicate little hands. My wife jumped off the bed, stumbled, and fell. Caleb's head hit the floor, and the resulting cry caught the attention of many of the dolls I was desperately trying to fight off and keep away. My wife tried to right herself and gather our son before the wave of small monsters got to them, but she was too slow. I watched as the dolls quickly swarmed Caleb and began tearing at his flesh. My wife started trying to get them away, but they turned on her when Caleb stopped thrashing. I made my way to them just as my wife stopped fighting. I saw the despair in her eyes as the doll with black hair and a gray, tattered dress bit a chunk from her throat. The creatures moved so fast, there were so many of them. We didn't stand a chance. I don't know how long I stood in my bedroom watching a horde of dolls ripping apart the 2 people I loved most in the world before I realized that I was no longer being attacked. Every porcelain creature was crowded around what was left of my wife and son, feasting on them. I regretted what I did next every day since I ran. I bounded down the steps as fast as my feet would carry me. I reached the front door when I heard a woman's voice come from the 2nd floor.
"That's right, my children. Fill those bellies so you can grow big and strong."
I shut the door behind me and fell down the steps of the front porch after vomiting up the cookies I had eaten earlier that night. I turned to look at the house. Peeking out of the window, illuminated by the colorful Christmas lights, was a gaunt woman wearing a tattered black dress. She smiled through a veil of stringy hair as the doll climbed up the front of her dress and into her arms, then closed the curtains. Noah, in a kind of way, it reminds me of the Alvin and the Chipmunk scene from a Disaster Movie. That scene really messed me up as a child. Like, 8-year-old me had nightmares. I love visiting my grandma. She always makes the food that I like and in large quantities, and spoils me. With the hustle and bustle of college life, it's nice to go back to my childhood and allow myself to be spoiled for a few hours every few weeks. Even though she has 6 grandchildren, she made it clear that I'm her absolute favorite. She'd often have the whole family around for dinner, and after they left, she'd bring out the good stuff she made just for me. We usually have a big Christmas dinner together with the whole family. However, as the years go by and the younger ones start growing up, fewer and fewer people show up. Last year, everyone already made plans, forgetting about poor Grandma. I don't blame them, but they often forget how much these visits mean to her, especially ever since Grandpa died. That's why when I talked on the phone with her and she asked me if I had any plans, I lied to her and I told her I didn't. She immediately jumped at the opportunity to politely invite me, going so far as to offer me to sleep over at her place. She said there's one room which hasn't been used in years and I could stay in there. I immediately said yes and agreed to stay over, realizing how happy that would make her. I canceled the plans I made with my friends, telling them something else came up. Although they were bummed about it a little, their drinking party wouldn't stop because of me. That was the last Christmas I would ever spend with my grandma. On Christmas Eve, I arrived to my grandma's place and she greeted me like she always does, with a tight hug and lots of kisses. I barely even stepped inside when she started offering me food. She had already made what could only be described as an all-you-can-eat buffet. We dug in, and once we were done, she showed me where I could sleep for the night. It was a cozy little bedroom, which apparently used to be my mom's room when she was little. Grandma told me not to leave my room during Christmas night in order to avoid disturbing Santa in his work. She said that if I really needed to use the bathroom, I could, but to be extremely quiet and not go downstairs. On the nightstand, she left a list of things I should do before I go to bed to ensure I get a good present. I decided to play along and abide by the rules. I told her I'd read it before I go to bed and do everything necessary, and she seemed content with that. She wished me a good night and left the room. I was pretty tired from the trip there and the enormous dinner I've eaten, so I lay down on the bed and involuntarily fell asleep within minutes. I awoke a few hours later. I glanced at my watch and realized it was 3:01 a.m. I got up to grab a glass of water downstairs from the kitchen and groggily walked through the dark, trying to avoid any loud noise or turning on the lights not to wake Grandma. I went downstairs and turned on the kitchen light, gulping down a glass of water. I glanced toward the living room at the Christmas tree, and something caught my attention under the glow of the decoration lights. There was a small plate with a tiny paper that said, "For Santa." I reckoned it was cookies and milk, but when I got closer I realized the plate was empty. Red liquid was in it, and right next to the plate was a small bucket. Obviously I found this weird, but I figured that Grandma may have just forgotten to put it away or something. I turned off the kitchen lights and returned to my room. Just then remembered the list that Grandma gave me. I grabbed it off my nightstand and started reading. Dear James, thank you for visiting me for Christmas. You made your grandma really happy. Now Christmas is a little different in this house than what you're probably used to, so it's very important that you follow these rules on the list. 1. Make sure to close your windows and ensure they are closed properly. These old windows don't work properly sometimes, so if you feel like cold air is coming in, let me know. 2. Don't put any wood in the fireplace after 9 p.m. Santa will be really angry if it's scalding in the chimney or if there's any smoke. 3. You didn't forget about milk and cookies, did you? I stopped reading and chuckled at the list. Grandma clearly wanted me to follow the basic rules for Santa like when I was a kid, but again, I decided to oblige. I continued reading the list. In this household, we don't use milk and cookies. We use raw meat and blood. I already left a bucket by the Christmas tree, and there's a raw piece of chicken I put on the plate. Santa sure loves his diet. 4. If you are woken up by the sound of scratching or knocking on your window, ignore it. Your room is on the second floor and there's no way to reach up to it. In fact, it's best not to look there, but if you see someone beckoning you, pretend they're not there. They may try to open the window from the outside. That's why it's important to keep the window closed. 5. You may hear growling coming from the kitchen. It's okay because Santa never comes upstairs. Since I already left the chicken for him, that should satisfy him. By this point, I was sure Grandma was just messing with me. That was until I heard the sound of 3 gentle knocks on the window behind me. I froze in place, staring at the list, but practically staring through it. 3 more gentle knocks ensued, but I did my best not to give it away that I heard them. Once again, there were 3 more knocks, and then the sound of scratching started. First gently, and then louder, as if a rat was trying to bite through the wall. It lasted for around a minute until it completely stopped. Only when it did I gather enough courage to slightly shift my position. That was a mistake, though, because when I looked down to the floor at the light which was cast in from the window, I saw the unmistakable shadow in the form of a humanoid silhouette stretched across. I couldn't tell for sure, but it looked like whoever was there held both his hands on the window and stared directly toward me. I decided that the best thing to do is continue reading the list to try and distract myself. 6. If someone walks into your room while you're sleeping and you happen to wake up, pretend that you're still asleep. In the worst case scenario, the person will sit on the edge of your bed and observe you. So do your best not to let them know you are awake. If you feel their breath on your neck and it gets progressively closer, it means they've realized you're awake. 7. You may hear me calling you from downstairs. Don't listen to it. I will under no circumstances go downstairs during the night. Last and most important rule. If you get up to go to the bathroom, never, ever, ever turn on any lights in the house. He has trouble noticing you in the dark, but if you turn on the lights, he will be able to follow you wherever you go, and then not even locking the door will help. 9. Follow these simple rules, and in the morning we can open your Christmas presents. Love, Grandma. The scratching and knocking had already stopped by the time I was done reading, and the shadow from the window was gone. I got into bed and covered myself over my head, shivering, and not from the cold. Sometime during the night I heard my door open, but I did my best to ignore the footsteps and the low growling noise. I either passed out or fell asleep sometime later, but all I know is I woke up from the sound coming downstairs from the kitchen. I shot up, looking around the room and out the window, rubbing my temples, thinking about the nightmare I had. I left my room and immediately heard my grandma's voice calling me from downstairs to come open my presents. I told her I'm coming, when I suddenly felt a grip on my wrist. I turned around and saw Grandma there, staring at me wide-eyed. She leaned in and whispered in my ear with a trembling voice, "You turned on the lights, didn't you?" Okay, and that does it for our holiday horror stories. I don't know, I had a really hard time reading these this time. Felt like I stumbled a few more times. I hope you enjoyed this as much as I enjoyed reading them. Happy holidays, and see you later.